All right, ladies and gentlemen. So today what we're going to do is we're going to continue with uh, kind of looking at northern industrialization in the antebellum period and kind of how it's growing. So in class we focused on the transportation revolution, a little bit of urbanization and immigration. Today we're going to focus on really kind of how factories develop in the United States and some of the social classes and kind of the social class uh, clashes that take place after industrialization really grows and develops. So we're going to start with an idea known as Yankee ingenuity, which may be a term that you've never heard before. So what this kind of refers to is kind of Americans' ability to be creative and to solve problems. So you really start to see this early in the 1800s. Tons of inventions are being made within the United States. And so we're just going to go kind of go through a few of them. And it really kind of starts to build off of one another. So if you look at what's happening within the United States, uh, first, the numbers really don't lie. In 1800, there's only 41 patents approved within the entire country. So that means there's 41 new inventions that are made. By 1860, it's over 4,000. So we're inventing a lot of things, uh, and Americans seem to be very adaptive to new things. If you look at this quote here, uh, basically anything new Americans are interested in. And I think that's a very unique American characteristic to kind of get rid of the old and kind of adapt to the new. We're a very adaptive society. We like new technology. We like to kind of get into the new things. And you can see the same thing goes on in American society today. So Americans of the 1800s, early 1800s, and then late 1800s, they're constantly adapting and kind of building off of new technology. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that America is a new society. Even today, we're a kind of relatively new society. So we're willing to change, we're willing to adapt, we're willing to kind of take on new and different ways of living. So this whole idea of being creative, inventive, and willing to adapt is it becomes known as something called Yankee ingenuity. Now, just to go through some of the inventions. So Eli Whitney's cotton gin, we talked about that in class. So we're not really going to kind of go over it again now. But Eli Whitney also is famous for, and he's not as well known for this, but this is just as important. He also owns a gun factory, and in his gun factory, one of the innovations that they make is they have something called interchangeable parts in their rifles. And why this is so important is that if, let's say, for example, a bunch of different people, they all create guns, they build guns on their own. Now, each person might be skilled in the craft of making the gun, but they might do it slightly different than the person next to them. And what that means is that if a part breaks on my gun, I can't take the piece out of your gun and fit it perfectly into mine because they're built from different molds. So what Eli Whitney did in his factory, it's efficient business-wise, and it also allows for a lot of ability to take pieces from different parts of the rifle is they use one mold, one model. And we kind of take that for granted now that like things are built from one mold or from one model. Like think of a car. If something breaks on your car, you can go to the factory, you can go to the Nissan dealership, you can go to the Honda dealership, and they'll have a part that will fit perfectly in your car, and it'll fit in every other model of that same car perfectly. Um, that we take for granted now, but that was kind of a revolutionary idea, and it kind of transforms business and transforms the way that things are done. Uh, Other inventions, Robert Fulton and the steamboats. We talked about the significance of this in class. Huge for upriver travel, especially on big rivers in the United States like the Missouri and the Mississippi River. So he's actually from New York, and his first steamboat is called the Clermont, which is going up and down the Hudson River. So has a huge impact across the United States as far as transporting things on rivers and canals. Now, some of these other guys we're going to go through relatively quickly, but you have people who are building different kinds of factories, different kind of mills, like Oliver Evans. Some of these names you might recognize, like John Deere, if you ever go out to, if you like farm supplies and tractors. John Deere's are still, widely popular. So he's inventing the first steel plow here, and this is when his company got going. It's still an American company now. Other farm implements that are helping with production, the mechanical reaper by this guy Cyrus McCormick. Uh, this is a huge invention. Samuel Morse, he invents something called the telegraph. Now, on Friday in class, we talked about transportation revolution, and I briefly mentioned that there's also a communication revolution that happens at the same time, and this is huge for the communication revolution. So I'm not sure how many of you guys are familiar with Morse code. It's kind of like a series of beeps. So think of telegraph and telegraph wires as the precursor to telephones. Uh, it's similar to telephones. You'd have these poles and these wires that would extend across the country, and they would link different either businesses or government buildings and sometimes private homes to each other. And you would have a machine in your house called a telegraph machine, or in your business or establishment, a telegraph machine. The only difference is that when you got a message, you wouldn't be able to talk to somebody directly. They didn't have that technology to transmit somebody's voice across, hundreds or thousands of miles at the time. So what you would get is instead like a series of electronic beeps would come out of the machine, and somebody would have to sit there at the telegraph machine, and there was a code, and so like a series of beeps meant a certain word or it meant a certain phrase, and somebody would have to sit there and decode the message as the message was coming in. So this is not really used again for like personal messages very much. It's much more used for like big things, news being transmitted across um, large amounts in the United States, government messages. But think of how revolutionary this is. The messages can get there almost instantaneously, so just like a telephone. It takes a while to transmit them to decode the messages, but this is going to link in the United States, and very soon it even links in the United States with Europe. So they drop a transatlantic cable across the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, which links in Europe to the United States. So think about it. News now can travel almost instantaneously across the Atlantic. It can travel from the north to the south to the west. So they start building these, you know, these cables all across the United States. And this is huge. This is your first communications revolution. So you have transportation revolution, communication revolution. Things are changing in the United States. We're starting to be in a lot of ways more linked in. Even though we talked about a lot of sectionalism, in certain ways the connections are growing within the United States. Now, the other big development that's happening within the United States at the time is the development of factories and factory labor. So the first thing that you want to understand, there's connections with European society and kind of across the Atlantic. So like this guy, for example, Samuel Slater, he's really that they call him the father of the factory system, and he's not American, he's British. And he leads Britain, and he kind of brings with him secrets across the Atlantic Ocean. The British government didn't want uh, the factory system and a lot of the machines that were used in the factories, the secrets on how they worked and how they were built. The British government did not want these things to get out of Britain because at this point, late 1700s, early 1800s, they kind of have monopoly on factory production, and they're making tons of money off of this. Remember I told you guys that Britain was known as the workshop of the world, that they made everything. And so like somebody like this who leaves and kind of brings secrets with him kind of helps the United States, helps other European countries. And he's not the only person that did this, but he has kind of a big impact. So they start to kind of develop more of a factory system. Now, when you look at factories, there's a couple of different kinds of systems that are developed within the United States. So we're really going to focus on what's known as the Lowell Waltham system, named after two people who really kind of piloted the system within the United States. And we're going to focus on kind of Lowell's factories and Lowell's mills. But there's other kinds of systems as well. So there was something called the putting out system, which is where kind of instead of having workers come to a centralized location, a factory, they would kind of like piecemeal the work out to local farmers, and they would kind of make the stuff and then bring it back to the central location. So it's kind of the opposite of bringing workers to a factory. So they had all different kinds of systems. Now, this system is kind of one of the first where it's going to kind of build factories. And in the case of Lowell, Massachusetts, and the Lowell factory system, they pretty much build a small town for their workers. And the idea here, they build this in Massachusetts, and where they're going to get their workers from is basically the surrounding countryside. So it's a factory town entirely, and it pretty much had everything that the people needed that worked there. Um, the best comparison that I can make to kind of like Lowell, Massachusetts would be kind of like if you went away to college to a university. Uh, you go to the university and everything is there. You have dormitories, somewhere to sleep. You have dining halls. You have places to buy things, all within the campus. The only difference here is that they're not going for school, the workers. The workers are going for labor, okay? Now, who's working in these factories is important as well. Um, you have people coming from the surrounding countryside, and there's really two big groups that are coming. So the first one are what would be called like the Yankee labor force or the local American labor force. And these were primarily young women, basically like your age, 15, 16, 17 years old. And the idea here was that they would go work in the factories for like 2 or 3 years, uh, and then they would come back and get married. So it was kind of like a way to earn money before you would get married. And that's one of the groups of people who are working there. The other group of people that's going to be working there are going to be primarily the new Irish immigrants. Again, mostly women. So it's mostly women working in these factories. And these are textile mills that are being built up in New England, which is the primary industry that's developing within New England at the time. And so these Irish immigrants are also working there, and they had a different mentality. They're not planning to stay for a couple of years and then go back and get married. They need that extra income, that extra source of income, and so they're staying for much longer periods of time. And you know, the conditions on these factories are not ideal. So what we're talking about, one important thing to understand is you're talking about pre-unionized industrial labor. So these women do not have unions. There's really very little to no oversight of the factories. So the working conditions are not good. They're loud. A lot of places don't have windows. And so the system is kind of not what it's not ideal. Okay. And so this is an important idea to understand. Kind of when we talk about labor and labor unions within the United States. Remember, Civil War United States, not just in Lowell, but in most factories in the United States, because other factories are developing in other places within American cities. All different kinds of factories are developing. They don't really have labor unions. A little bit starts to develop pre-Civil War, but they never really take off in big ways. So there's a lot of pressure from business owners to stop any kind of labor movement or any kind of labor coalition from developing. They really try and work hard to stop that from happening. Now, when you look at other things that are happening within American society, so factories are developing, but as we talked about, cities are also developing. So we're just going to talk a little bit quickly about kind of like social classes and cities that are developing within the United States. So what you start to see for the first time in the United States is what we would call urban slums. And urban slums are a little bit different than, let's say, like a poor neighborhood now. A slum really is an area of a city that um, lacks a lot of the facilities, lacks a lot of the organization that we would see typical in a city now. So they have zero building codes. They're super overcrowded. They don't have sanitation. They don't have police forces. They don't have firemen. And these neighborhoods are primarily going to be populated by immigrants, and at this time, Irish immigrants. And so what starts to happen is you start to see in American society, as we industrialize, and you're going to see this trend develop after the Civil War as well, um, gaps of wealth starts to grow a little bit. So you start to see more of a concentration in the top, and like the workers are, not making as much, and that has a lot to do with the fact that they're not earning these, equal wages. Just before we go, kind of one of the worst neighborhoods is going to be this neighborhood called the Five Points in New York City. And so you're going to analyze that